Welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Here to talk all things hockey are your hosts, Brad Crisco, Ryan Hanna, and Evan Lobsinger.
Every time we're developing show notes, Brad senses weakness, some uncertainty as to what we're going to put in each block of the show. And when he senses that, he pounces. He's like, hey, I could talk about offside reviews or goaltender interference reviews. And we have to be like, no, Brad, shut up. Go away. The same way if we left the room, Brad, you and I, and let Evan talk about whatever we wanted, for sure, one, we'd be canceled by the time we got back. And secondly, this show would instantly be a golf podcast. If Evan and I left and came back 3 hours later, you would just be done the introduction on why you think video review should be abolished completely.
Are we talking hockey or all sports? Because
see, this is what I mean. This is what I like. This guy's so annoying, man. He takes an opinion that no one's on the other side of. Pretty much no one's on the other side of.
You've argued me on this one numerous times.
And I have conceded in the past that it is now in a place where I think you are largely correct, but you make me want to argue with you.
But here's the thing. I will drop this when it actually gets changed. If I have to, if we as a collective have to deal with this constantly and everybody hates it and nobody likes it, then it's going to continue to be a topic.
You know, Evan, how you look at me and Brad talk before the episode and you'll just say things like, you two are sick in the head. You realize that, right? I'm starting to understand I need to just be more like you and just turn it all off.
Just got to disassociate. You can't change it as a singular person. You just got to put the newspaper up when the reviews come on.
You gotta have 6 or 7 Labatt Blue Lights, play some croquet with your buddies, and show up loaded to the podcast.
That's right.
Although, I'm sorry, this one you're gonna have to tackle, with no aids. So it's gonna be, although people are gonna be a little bit less entertained than they were last episode.
I will not be better than I was last time.
Let's jump into the Winged Wheel Podcast. Hello, folks, here to talk to you about all things Detroit Red Wings hockey, the world of the NHL, and lots more. Welcome to the show. I'm one of your hosts, Ryan Hanna.
I'm Brad Crisco.
And I'm Evan.
On this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast, we're going to be jumping into some topics that are going to be the introduction to a lot of conversation leading into the summer. The first being free agency and what Detroit is going to do at right defense. Options there that are really popular with Red Wings fans, options that are a little bit less popular, but maybe what management would be taking a look at. Who's available? Does Detroit even go for them? And lots more. We're going to be talking about Detroit's prospect pool and how far it's come since, the rebuild started, so to speak. Some other Red Wings news for current, future, and former Red Wings before we jump into our prospect profile for this episode. Another player who is likely going to be in Detroit's range and may be of note for them in terms of what they're looking for. And then news from across the NHL, Tampa Bay's trade back, I should say, Marner and Nashville rumors, the playoff updates as the conference finals are set, predictions, how we've all done so far, and then some other news from across the NHL before we jump into overtime. Before all that, I want to let you know that this podcast is primarily supported by our Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast if you want to support the show. If you join the Dub Club, you get some really great benefits, like access to our bonus overtime episodes, which record right after these main ones. You get to hear us let loose, have fun, talk about hockey, answer any questions that didn't make the main show, and then talk about everything not hockey related too. Evan's croquet match that he got rained out of or he timed out of from last episode. If you're one of those sickos that wants to hear more about that, that's something that you'll get in there. Also, you're automatically entered into all of our giveaways. For example, last season and the season before, we gave away 2 tickets to every Detroit Red Wings home game, the vast majority going to our Patreon supporters. And finally, you get access to our Patreon exclusive Discord. So again, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. Shane Gostisbehere had a great season for the Detroit Red Wings. He, as you noted last episode, Brad, he was a huge factor in Detroit being productive enough offensively. A ton of offense coming from that blue line pushed them towards almost making a playoff spot. Like, he was a needle mover for Detroit. He very likely has priced himself out of being able to return unless Detroit chooses to prioritize bringing him back or he takes a discount. But again, for that much offense in the position he plays, he's going to probably command a pretty penny, and you can't blame the player for that. And also, let's call it what it is. He was great offensively and oftentimes had to be moved out of positions of responsibility defensively because he just couldn't do it. That's not the player he is. We knew that coming in, and it's not like that really changed. Sometimes it was okay, but a lot of times it was bad defensively. Detroit now is looking for someone to play right D behind Mo Seider on the second pair. It's not going to be Axel Sandin Pellikka next season unless something changes drastically. The plan is for him to return to Sweden. And Detroit's probably not going to want to take a step back. There also happen to be some names out there that aren't like super high-end names. Maybe one of them might be, but that could fill that right D role in the second pair. How much of that is trying to elevate a player into a role to make it fit your narrative, and how much of that is, yeah, you can actually get them, but they're going to cost you a little bit? That's what we're going to talk about here. But what does Detroit do at right D for next season, knowing they need more stability from their blue line?
There's, in my mind, two acceptable ways to approach this. And it's a little bit of the inverse of what they've been doing at what we'll call premium positions. What are some higher priorities in free agency, which I think right D, second pair, is probably one of the highest priorities this offseason in terms of now and the future. Because even when Sandin Pellikka comes in, I don't think he's a guy that they're going to lean on for 20, 22 minutes a game. They might, but a lot of that will be on the power play. And even though I think he'll be, an average NHL defender at 5-on-5, that's not a guy you really want to lean on in key defensive situations. And they need to take the burden off Mo Seider. So understanding that I personally am okay if they take a small step back this year because of the youth movement, that almost doesn't matter because there isn't a youth option on right D for this upcoming season. So the way I approach free agency and this glaring hole, assuming trade isn't an option, which looking around the league, probably not super likely. You have to be aggressive in free agency, identify the guy you feel is the best option there, and get him. You don't settle for option 2, 3, or 4, because that's when you start getting into the, Ben Sherratt, Justin Holl contracts where you're paying way too much for a mediocre player, which is a little harsh to them, but everybody knows what I'm getting at. If you are identifying it as a major need and this is going to be a gap in the team for a while, address it appropriately or find a stopgap. Find your Shane Gostisbehere, your 1 year. This guy can hold down the fort, but he's not a long-term solution. He's not anything special. He is an affordable guy. I'm okay with either option because I'm pretty aware of where the team's at right now. If I'm looking at the right-handed D UFA market, feel free, everybody can disagree with me. I'd say the most talented player available is probably Brett Pesce. Okay, that could be a 4, 5, 6 year solution. You're probably going to have to overpay for a little bit, but he's genuinely good. He might be Carolina good and then a little disappointing when he gets out of that system, but
I like that everyone knows what you mean by that.
Yeah. But he's more likely actually good. So you get a very legitimate guy to slot in behind Mo Seider for a long time and to take the burden off Mo Seider, because not only are you getting a good defenseman, you might be unlocking a little bit more in Mo Seider with favorable matchups every once in a while. Not saying Mo isn't your go-to guy for big situations anymore, but it's an option then, especially on the road where you don't control matchups as much. Or, like I said, you don't go out and pay 4x4 for some guy who's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you strike out on, I'm not saying Pesce would be Yzerman's target, but if he is, hypothetically, if you strike out on him, then you let the market play out and see where you can get value, which he's done with other positions and other free agents in past years, going, all right, we waited, the market calmed down, and I think that might have actually been what happened on Gostisbehere, and now we got a deal on him. Phenomenal. So I'm good with either option. If they go back into that middle tier again is where I'm going to get irritated.
A lot of thoughts on what you just said, but to the last point there where you wait for the market to come, I think that's the ideal scenario if you do miss on your first guy. But one thing I'll say is I'm wondering if that's less likely to happen this year with the cap increase, because the market cooling off and guys not getting the contracts that they maybe deserved was probably a function more of the restricted salary cap that we've dealt with for years now because of COVID and other factors. And that's now starting to be released. Not fully, like the increases are coming incrementally over the next few years, but more teams are going to have more to play with now. So it's a really good point, Brad, but I'll say maybe caution against banking on that happening. But if that happens, then that's ideal. You're right. This is a really unique scenario because what do we spout off on this podcast about so often? Don't overpay in free agency and lose sight of the long-term goal because you're eating up cap space, you're blocking, young players from coming up, et cetera, et cetera. But this is that unique hole in the roster where, there's no long-term solution. And having a number one defenseman is well and good. But if you only have a number one defenseman, what happened to Moritz Seider this past season is what happens to your number one defenseman. You need a good, solid top four. Even if a guy isn't an absolute top pair defenseman, which is what everyone's going to want this, big name coming in hypothetically to be, you really can't imagine the upstream and downstream effects of having a solidified second pair. Detroit really lacks stability on defense, and it just throws off entire games. When your defense isn't trustworthy, your goaltending gets worse. Your goaltender can't get into a rhythm. You're allowing shots from high danger areas too often. Your offense can't get going. You can't run breakouts because you're so hemmed in. Guys get gassed. You're wasting premium time on ice from Larkin and other players. It goes on and on and on. So the stability really pays off. So as much as it pains me to say, I fully agree with you, Brad. This is an area where I don't mind Detroit taking a swing, and we'll get into the players in a second here. One thing I will say, though, you have to make a couple assumptions about Detroit's cap situation. One, they are going to move at least one contract, probably going to try to make it Justin Hall's. Oli Mata's probably a lot more movable. Maybe it's a Fabry type. And two, and I don't want this to be the case, you're assuming Patrick Kane signs elsewhere, because then that frees up more money that you would have allocated to him. And then there's other factors. You want, if Perron's going to re-sign, it has to be team friendly, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm all for this, but they're going to have to find a way to afford it because it's not built in right now.
Well, for me, Steve Yzerman needs to identify if this free agency crop is the one where it's worth swinging for a big name. If the answer is, if he thinks it's yes, I think there are some interesting guys available. If it's no, then you just go and find a stopgap, which I think there's a bunch of names there as well. So he needs to identify the route he wants to take, given where the team's at, what the cap structure looks like, obviously the increase in the cap going forward. It's going to be, what he does will be very indicative of where he thinks the team is and where they're going in the short to long term.
I don't see him doing anything other than trying to make sure that Red Wings are at least as good as last season in terms of the standings, or they have a shot to be. We've talked about this on the show a lot, but to summarize, Detroit has to move up some of their youth. They have to. We can talk about whether or not it was a mistake to not stagger that earlier. Largely what our opinions are on that, but that's done. Like, they have to do it. Johansson has to come up. Berggren has to come up. They are no longer waiver exempt. You can't. Edvinsson's now on the team, and he probably should have been sooner. Like, these guys have to come up. If Kasper or Mazur earn a spot, Kasper or Mazur need to be on the team. And that's not to speak of Nate Danielson as well. The flip side of that is you can't bring in all those rookies at once. We are probably as pro-rookie, young player, bring up the young talent and reform the Red Wings of a trio as you're going to find. And we will be the first ones to tell you very few NHL teams are going to bring up that many rookies and get better. It's just not the way this league works. So what Yzerman has to do is find that balance of how do you add to supplement that? And addition could be bringing Patrick Kane back. It could be bringing Perron back at a cheap price and bringing in someone else. I don't know, but it's a tough line to walk. And it's not a bad thing if they take a step back initially and then over the season they get better, or they finish in the same spot next season, because we're looking at the reality of what this team is on paper. But in terms of what you ask Steve Yzerman his goals are, I think he wants to not take too big of a step back, if at all.
Well, it depends how you're kind of defining everything here, because as I talked about last episode, every decision needs to be made with the cup window in mind. It doesn't mean those are the only decisions you're making. We know this team's not competing for a Stanley Cup in the next 2 to 3 years, barring absolute miracles and breakouts from like 2 or 3 prospects that we never saw coming.
Connor McDavid wants to be a Red Wing.
Yeah.
Saying it here first.
Weird things like that. Barring something like that, you're building for that cup window, so you're signing contracts in mind. That's why you're getting your guy or you're taking a stopgap, because anybody you sign for 1 or 2 years doesn't really matter. If it's someone good enough to maybe help you get into the playoffs and boost the confidence a little bit, sure, great. There's literally no harm in that. If you want to go out and sign someone who's actually good and young enough where it's possible to 6, 7, 8 years, okay, well, they're going to factor into when you want to plan on really being competitive. Great. It's those 3, 4, 5-year contracts for middling players. I can't stress that enough. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and the Red Wings are almost there already on that particular problem. So they can't make it worse. If your preferred option is 6x6 or something like that for Brett Pesce, great. I see the benefit. If your preferred option is, a 2x3 for Jalen Chatfield, I see the logic there. And I'm okay with both. It's all about making decisions around whatever Steve Yzerman perceives is the true, I don't know what to call it, go zone, cup window. Like, we have to have everything in place properly and paid appropriately for that time, which is why, circling back to the whole cap situation for this offseason, why I'm still pro pay Seider and Raymond now, the money and the term, because it will be better value then. It might limit you now in terms of what your options are. Maybe because of that, you can't get a Brett Pesce. You have to do a Jalen Chatfield. So be it. It's still for the greater good.
If Shane Gostisbehere is not coming back because he's priced out, fine. But I think if that is the case, you have to allocate some of that money to Patrick Kane. And if the Red Wings are gonna pay Brett Pesce 6x6, I'd rather say no and re-up on Patrick Kane, barring, if it's gotten out of control. Obviously, you walk away from that. But the Red Wings aren't going to be able to fill the point totals that Shane Gostisbehere got this year with, I think, almost anybody on the board.
Yeah.
There might be one name that I'll pull out later and we'll talk about, but I don't see a lot of the defensive free agents available that would do so. So I would rather put the money back into Patrick Kane because they're going to have a much more difficult time filling the point per game pace he was at forward.
So some of the names that have come up in Red Wings conversations, the stopgap solutions maybe because they're older but still effective players. First is Chris Tanev, who at age 34, he'll be 35 at the end of this calendar year. So really you're going to have age 35 Chris Tanev. He's getting expensive even at that age because obviously Dallas is maybe the cup favorite right now, and he's obviously going to want to choose where he goes. He's finishing up a $4.5 million per year contract. He's not signing long term. He's 35, but he has the option now to make a lot of money at the end of his career because he was coveted at the deadline. He has now performed remarkably well for Dallas, and God knows how expensive he'll be if they win the cup. But he's a guy who, he plays good defense. You don't really appreciate it a lot of the times because it's not on the score sheet, but he plays really good defense. Solid, stable defense, and it's the kind of thing where if you do it right, it ages well, and that's what Chris Tanev is. And the next guy is, I cannot believe I'm saying this, but with how well he played with Vancouver, Tyler Myers might not be so bad, and that could be a cheaper version of what you're looking at with Tanev.
I thought you were going to say Filip Hronek.
No, that will be very expensive.
Well, we might as well bring the guys back. Who else is a free agent this year?
Anthony Mantha.
Tyler Bertuzzi. We're getting the band back together. The first last dance.
Can you imagine, hey, Dylan, you know how we traded all of your best friends away? They're coming back like that end scene from Avengers Endgame.
They're just going to break out of like a paper mache octopus.
Except they trip out of it because that band lost every game they ever played, it seemed.
It'll be on brand for Tyler Bertuzzi to fall on the ice the moment he steps on as a Red Wing.
That is a terrific point. The one disclaimer we should probably make before we get into these. Every player we're going to talk about in terms of should the Red Wings sign him, the answer is yes, assuming the contract is reasonable.
Yep.
But we have the understanding that free agent contracts are almost never reasonable. That's the crux of free agency. So keep that in the back of your mind with everything we're saying here.
There's a reason why every player tries to get to free agency as quickly as possible.
Yes. Exactly.
Two things are true. Many things are true, actually. One, unrestricted free agents are the most expensive things you can buy in the NHL if you're a GM. Two, the cap is going up, so players are going to demand more dollars. And three, Detroit still is not an upper echelon team, and so the premium goes up for them to convince a good player to come here now. That is less of a factor than it was in previous years, but we know Detroit has had to pay more in previous years for that reason. Sherratt, Kopp, others. That was a thing. You pay more in term, you pay more in dollars. So keep all of that in mind and factor that in with what Brad said. This is all with a big assumption that it's on a reasonable deal. So with the two that I started, before we get to Pesce, Chatfield, Roy, Myers or Tanev, I know you just said it would be yes at the right contract, but I actually really like the 2 to 3 years or whatever it might be for either of those guys.
100%. Tanev, they both scare me for different reasons. Tanev scares me because that age drop off could be almost any day now with where he's at. And Tyler Myers scares me because he's Tyler Myers. He's the chaos giraffe.
We have made fun of him on this podcast. That's how bad he was. But, players change over time.
One thing we've noticed over the years, and not that we're smart, everybody in the world has noticed this. Reputation gets guys paid. I don't think Tyler Myers has a great reputation. I think these playoffs have kind of maybe proved a lot of people wrong about how comically bad he might actually be because he's actually been good. He still has made some mistakes, but and Chris Tanev's had this reputation as like this warrior and your ultimate defensive defenseman, which is true to a big extent.
He's also running out of teeth fast.
Yeah. It makes me think Myers is going to come at better value.
Yeah.
Because I think Tanev's only going to sign a 2 or a 3 year contract, but I think it's going to be expensive. I think Myers is only going to sign a 2 or a 3 year contract, and I think his AAV will be less.
I dislike Tyler Myers more as a hockey player, but I like him more from a financial perspective.
I think that's where I'm at as well between those two.
Also fun as hell. Like just pure chaos. Absolute pure chaos player.
If you're going to lose a game, you might as well be entertained while you do it.
Keep that in mind when it's January next year and the Red Wings have lost like 14 games.
Do you know how many boring losses we've suffered through in this rebuild? I'll take any step forward.
Evan, you said keep in mind. Brother, we had the Ehlers conversation last episode and someone commented, said, Ryan and Brad's annual Ehlers discussion. And I went, oh my God. Yeah, it is, isn't it? I don't even remember. Every time we do it, my brain's like, hey, you're talking about Nikolai Ehlers on the podcast for the first time ever. That's how you know what we're giving you as a
truly remarkable player.
I also think I called Vancouver the President's Trophy winner last episode like a dummy, so take that for what it will. Okay, those two players, it really is going to depend. What do they want to do on the maybe the last contract or the second last contract of their careers, depending on length and the value. How Dallas does the rest of the season is going to probably dictate a lot of what Tanev gets. Maybe the highest price and biggest name one is what's Brett Pesce going to do? Because can Carolina pay him? They haven't been able to yet. I think they offered him, 5x5 or 6x5 in the past, and he's let it run out here to unrestricted free agency. That one is like he's coming off a $4.025 million cap hit. He's going to want to raise, quite obviously. But if he's asking for anywhere near what Filip Hronek's asking for example, to me, that's the one I'm scared of. But if you can get him in at a reasonable AAV, he's 29 years old right now. He turns 30 in November. That one's not bad to give some term to, in my mind. I know you alluded to that.
Yeah, he's got a game that, in theory, should age pretty well. relatively speaking. I admit he's probably on talent the best of the group, but that 30 in November scares the hell out of me. And the fact that he is the most talented, yeah, he's going to have his suitors, and I don't know if I want to be paying him to his age 36, 37 seasons, which, again, if I'm Brett Pesce, I'm absolutely trying to get 6 or 7 years in free agency if I can. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. I like him. I like the player. I think he's a guy, though, that's going to price himself out of a lot of teams who are interested.
2 Michigan kids are the names that are on a lot of people's minds. Matt Roy from Canton and Jalen Chatfield, the Hurricanes player. And I think the Hurricanes want to bring him back. I wouldn't be surprised if, both of them stay where they are, but both of them unrestricted free agents. And you don't have any ambitions of these guys being, first pair right D. Will either of them be everyday second pair right D? It's a big task to be a second pair right defenseman. It's not like being a third line winger, for example. That's not being buried in the lineup. That is a lot of really important minutes. And I think it's a big step. Could Chatfield do that reliably for the Red Wings? You have to take stock. You might be taking a risk if you ask that. Matt Roy, maybe you're a little bit more confident in. Chatfield just turned 28 a week ago. Matt Roy turned 29 in March. How do you feel about either of those guys?
I think Matt Roy is going to be this offseason's. Everybody's going to be surprised at how much money and term he gets. And then everybody's going to go back and look at whatever data they want from him and go, oh.
Yeah.
I think he's going to be the sneaky underrated player to the public, but the NHL front offices are well aware. So I think he's going to get paid. Again, if it's Detroit, I'm not going to complain because he's really good. Contract depending, but yeah, I think he's going to be that guy this year.
There's a surprising amount of options at this position, right? Like not number one options. I get that. Everyone wants a number one pair, right?
Can I throw one out?
Hell yeah, dude.
Oh yeah.
It's the summer.
I got 2 actually, and 2 for very different reasons. First one, and maybe we can just get this out of the way very, very quickly because I have no idea what this would cost, but I think I have an idea. Brandon Montour.
Good luck.
Okay. That's what I needed to get to because his cap hit right now is like 3-something million. He's a half point per game player, played 23 minutes a game, or averaged 23 minutes per game. Maybe I'm now realizing as I say it out loud what that might cost.
30 years old.
But he's the guy I give the Brett Pesce plus money to because that guy is a guy you'd want as part of a winning team.
Yes.
So
yeah.
Here's my argument against Montour, and I really like Brandon Montour. Functionally, what are you getting out of Montour that you wouldn't get out of Gostisbehere?
Defense?
Not really. He's okay. He's nothing special defensively. He's great offensively. The underlying numbers say there's not a whole hell of a lot of difference between them other than Montour plays on a good team.
Do you think that's the good team or do you think that's Montour though? Because I view him as one of those guys who was picked up very intelligently by Florida and he's just excelled and grown in that role.
He did poorly in a lot of teams before he got to Florida. I do think those teams didn't appreciate what they had, but when stuff like that happens, I think the answer is somewhere in the middle. I think he is better than those teams gave him credit for. I think he is propped up a little bit by Florida, and I don't think he would replicate what he's done in Florida in Detroit.
Well, I don't think many of these guys would replicate what they do on their respective teams in Detroit until Detroit gets better. But I don't know. I think I agree with Evan. I think Montour is a gamer. He's the kind of guy you want on your team.
So here's my ultimate point on this one, though. I'm not super confident that he would do in Detroit what he's doing in Florida. I think he's going to get paid an ass ton money in terms of AAV and term more than Gostisbehere. And we know what Gostisbehere can do in Detroit. So for the amount of millions and years you're going to be saving, if you are interested in Montour, there is almost no reason to not just bring back Gostisbehere.
I figured Montour's most likely scenario is he stays in Florida because it's finally a fit for him there.
Yeah.
And they have such a great, like that organization's going to be good for a while. They obviously know how to run it now. The facilities for the players have improved so much. They have built a big culture team, and he's a fit. Plus the zero state income tax, he's going to like that. I side with you more. You're smiling because I said zero state income tax, and you got
No,
really
it's
happy.
not, because I'm starting to walk back the next person I want to bring up, but I've already...
You've committed.
This is a podcast. It's for entertainment.
That's right. I don't think the Montour poll was too crazy, Evan.
The next one... I'm such an idiot. Okay, where'd it go? Also a Carolina defenseman. Tony DeAngelo.
Oh my God.
Evan, we need someone who can play defense, man.
Okay. Well, let me tell you about Shane Gostisbehere and his defense.
Evan.
It was better than Tony DeAngelo's.
Okay.
Wow, I was like, wow, who could this be? It was as bad as described.
Yeah. Well, it's a thought experiment.
Well, here's what I'll say though, painful though it is. Steve Yzerman obviously has a connection to Tony DeAngelo, and I believe Detroit looked at Tony DeAngelo in the past. I just don't see him resolving their issues right now, which is that last season it wasn't offense from the blue line, it was getting your defenseman to defend, and Tony DeAngelo is personal opinions on the person aside, just so god awful at defending.
Okay, well, I get it.
Evan's an idiot, and this is what happens when he gives two thoughts in a row on a podcast.
What I will say is, to Ryan's point of, Yzerman does have a history with DeAngelo, and that was giving up on him very quickly despite drafting him in the first round. So do with that information what you will.
All right, well, if we're getting the band back together, then we can have Mark Stahl, Troy Stetcher, or Brendan Smith.
You know how I have a lot of time for Troy Stetcher. He's just not, he's the kind of guy where it's not the same as Daniel Sprong, but you're like, oh man, you're so good. You can play up the lineup. But the moment you get exposed to the bigger minutes, then the returns start to peter off a little bit. But I have a lot of time for Troy Stetcher as a depth defenseman. I would have preferred to have kept him over what Detroit did, quite honestly.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are some right shot defense or right side defense options. The projections are going to inform a lot of what Detroit can do. So as we approach free agency, we're going to be talking about that more. One other thing I want to talk about is this whole Filip Hronek situation. And again, we've talked about it lightly on previous episodes, but now that Vancouver's out and Filip Hronek very publicly it's been reported that he wants $8 million a year. There's this whole sentiment going around of, oh, maybe the Red Wings were right to trade him. And, Yzerman probably saw this coming the whole time. And that to me is funny. Like, this isn't like a victory lap or anything, but this is what the trade was the entire time. Vancouver gets a really good player right now. Detroit avoids having to pay him in the future. They sold him with a year left, so they got more value. They got a pick that got him Axel Sandin Pellikka, his replacement, and they saved the cap space in this trouble of losing him for nothing now. He's an RFA with Arbright, so it's not for nothing, but they sold him at higher value knowing that this was coming because he's at best, average defender who has the potential to be a really good offensive defenseman without the scoring touch that I think he should have with his shot, because he can't aim that thing he's like me off the tee. This isn't new. Why is this a surprise to anyone?
Because people don't pay attention.
Like, this is...
You ask the average Canucks fan who Detroit even took with that pick, they wouldn't have been able to tell you till a week ago.
Yeah.
Let's also not forget, like, when that trade happened, everyone was like, well, we weren't going to trade him, but if you're going to give us a first-round pick, we're going to be taking that.
Yes. That's almost exactly what Yzerman said.
So it's not like there's some, like, crazy long-term strategy by Steve Yzerman about how this is all played out, because I don't even think Canucks fans in their wildest dream would have thought Hronek would have the season he did. So no. I think that trade just was too good to be true for the Red Wings, and they pulled the trigger on that.
I also, I like Filip Hronek as a player. I hope he gets paid. I struggle to see Vancouver paying him 8x8, or if they trade his rights, another team doing so.
A right-handed defenseman who put up what he did this year. Ryan, are you new here?
Yeah, but a lot of that, how much of that is Quinn Hughes, right? How much of that is Vancouver's lethal offense?
And how many times have we seen this with similar situations in the past? A right-handed defenseman with a bit of snarl and a bit of offense seems to be tripping over each other to get to him.
And he's got the track record now. He's at worst a half point per game defenseman.
He was a half point per game defenseman in Detroit.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, that's Filip Hronek. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here and be back to talk to you about prospects. But first, we want to let you know that this episode of the Winged Wheel podcast is proudly brought to you by Labatt Blue Light. Created in 1983, this premium, light Canadian Pilsner is a delicately balanced beer brewed with Cascade hops and a blend of malt. It's fresh, crisp, and brewed to the highest quality standards. There's a little bit of Canadian kindness in every sip of Labatt Blue Light. How did it get in there? They're Canadian. That's how. You can spread the love yourself by sharing a Labatt. And when you do share a Labatt, you're not just sharing a beer. You're sharing an experience that'll pair with anything from hockey to a hoedown. So next time you're watching a hockey with your buds, be sure to share a Labatt, because while you might not all root for the same team, although we on this podcast do hope you're rooting for the Red Wings, you can all enjoy a Labatt Blue Light. We honestly love going to games in Detroit and seeing Labatt being the beer that fans clamor for all over the arena. It's a reliable beer and great to have in your hand when celebrating a goal. So head to the link in the description of this episode or the one you see on your screen to find Labatt in stores near you today. You must be 21 or older, and as always, enjoy responsibly. All right, welcome back. Before we get into our prospect profile here and talk about Nate Danielson or anything else, just want to recognize McKeen's Hockey ranked the Detroit Red Wings as the number one prospect pool in the NHL. This is in line with other prospect pool rankings where Detroit's, top 2 or 3. And so obviously McKeen's does good work, and they ranked Detroit's prospects as follows. Number 1, Simon Edvinsson, then Nate Danielson, Marco Kasper, Axel Sandin Pellikka, Sebastian Cossa, Trey Augustine, Carter Mazur, William Wallinder, Shai Buium, and then number 10, Dmitry Buchelnikov. So obviously you can, nitpick and talk about those rankings, but overall it's indicative of something that's become true slowly, as we are now 9+ years into this podcast, over time, which is that Detroit's prospect pool has come to the top of the league.
Yeah, can't wait for it to start paying off.
That's the next step here. You want it to be where the prospect pool starts to thin out because these guys are graduating. I will say there are a lot of high-end players in there, like Simon Edvinsson is a high-end prospect. Nate Danielson, Axel Sandin Pellikka, high-end prospects. There are a lack of the superstar forwards right now, and that's the part that Detroit's really missing. That said, though, that's like NHL teams looking for a number one defenseman. Every prospect pool in the league could use another superstar forward kind of thing. But it's indicative of Detroit having no lottery luck over the years.
The big thing for me is that 2 of those 10 are goalies, and to be a perennial contender, you need to have that stud goaltender, that stud quarterback, and they apparently have 2 of them. So that is a good sign to see.
When I'm feeling crazier and the studio's a little warmer in a future episode, I'm going to throw out some weird conspiracy theories regarding what Detroit can do with those goalies, because I think the rest of the league is going to take notice soon as to what Detroit has. The World Championships will have done a lot to show off Trey Augustine, Sebastian Cossa, depending on how far Grand Rapids can go. I think the league's going to start to take note of this. And as you're seeing Edmonton and Vancouver battle it out and see whose goalie can suck less, teams are going to go and try to move, heaven and hell to try to get a goalie for the future. So,
conspiracy theory? What, are you going to put both of them under a giant Red Wings jersey like 2 kids in a trench coat?
Well, now that you call it out, the league's going to be looking for it, Brad.
I think they were going to notice the 12 feet of goaltender in the net.
Hey, one of them's a lot smaller, so there's that. Evans just...
at 12 feet, I actually undershot it by about 7 to 9 inches.
I was told there'd be no math on this podcast, so I'm not fact-checking you on that one. Elsewhere, Nate Danielson tonight is making his home debut in the AHL. He obviously played in Game 2. The Griffins did not have a good game and lost that game to Milwaukee, but the series is tied 1-1 in a best-of-5 as the Griffins played tonight. We are currently recording at 7 p.m., so obviously we don't know the results of that game, but you will. So Nate Danielson's home debut at Van Andel Arena is coming up, and Nate Danielson, as Max Bultman posted, already spotted with the Winged Wheel Podcast Grand Rapids Griffins crossover hat. So that's extra points for him. He is objectively a better prospect now that he already is rocking that hat.
The black market lives.
Man, Carter Mazur's got to be pissed. Carter,
no, he's probably the one dealing. He's probably
knows a guy.
He's rich.
That's how all the players got it at once. Yeah, Carter Mazur was like, okay, supply's about to be released, then I'm gonna undercut them. That's what he's doing.
Make me sign a 2-way contract. I'll even that out.
You still haven't found the Armor Jagger bobbleheads.
No, they did find those.
Oh, they did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they were actually in Carter Mazur's basement.
There was Carter Mazur in his hats.
Okay. let's talk about other prospects. Let's jump into our 2024 NHL Draft Prospect Profile for this episode. And again, this is one that's going to be relevant to Detroit's range. Michael Hage, playing out of Chicago in the USHL, a Michigan commit. Michael Hage, who is he?
A kid whose name I'm hoping is pronounced Hage for all the Hage Against the Machine jokes we could make in the future.
That's actually, because then we would be able to drop Tage. But yeah, go on.
Exactly. Well, you made that point not long ago about the Red Wings lacking high-end offense in the system. Here's an option for you. He's a very divisive prospect because there's no doubt he has produced everywhere he's played and he can create offense. Playmaking, goal scoring. Guy can skate. In the offensive zone, he can do it all. He's a guy that you want the puck on his stick as much as possible because he makes things happen. And if you're sitting here listening to this going, well, why is he available at 15? Well, you probably know what's coming. The compete goes in and out, and the defensive game is severely lacking.
Oh, center Anthony Mantha.
Pretty much. I would say the all-around offensive ability is higher than Mantha's was going into his draft, although the goal scoring might not be as elite as Mantha's was. But there's a couple pieces of context that probably need to be mentioned here. His draft -2 year, he missed almost the entire season due to a shoulder injury, so that's going to set him back. And in the offseason before this past season, he lost his father. And he had a really tough, not really tough, but by his standards, a tough first half in the USHL this year with Chicago. Coming off an injury, dealing with an unbelievable tragedy like that. You can understand that physically he might not have been there. Mentally, he might not have been there. And it took him a while to get going because you talk to a lot of people and they'll say second half, he was the best player in the USHL, full stop, as a 17-year-old. So there's this question mark around him that nobody's going to be able to definitively answer. Were the compete issues circumstance? Or is that just a part of his package? Is that just who he is as a hockey player? Because if you're betting on the upside here, the upside could be significant, but also you could get Anthony Mantha. So it's he's a divisive prospect.
From what I could gather, his defensive game has drastically improved from 0. So he has the ability. Yes.
Does he want to be on a podcast?
He has the ability to identify his weaknesses and work on them. And I think that's not nothing, especially for someone of that age. And yeah, he had a tough start to this season, but through the first 10 games, I think he had 8 points. So, I mean, he
Air
really
quotations, tough start.
Tough start. So I watched a bunch of his film while I was having dinner tonight, and I'll say this, he reminds me a lot of Dylan Larkin and Jack Eichel.
He can skate, and
he has like
there.
that. Like,
just that, eh?
Just those two players. I don't know if you've heard of them.
Well, who did the Red Wings pick last time they were at 15 overall?
Sebastian Cossa.
Oh, I forgot they traded up. Way to ruin that joke for me. It's
I took so much joy in doing that.
Last forward they took at 15th overall.
Dylan Larkin.
He's got that sort of perimeter speed, but then he'll come to the inside and he's got that sort of like the hands and the release look to Jack Eichel. Obviously, if he ever became either of those two players, it's like he's going in the top 2.
Yes.
But there's a lot of intriguing aspects to his game. And, there's always the asterisk of, well, it all depends on how the board plays out. But if this kid interviews really well, I would not be shocked if he's one of the guys who's going earlier than what people project, because watching tape on him, he's electric and dynamic. And that's something you can't take away from these kids when they play in these leagues.
And the one thing that's worth pointing out to Evan's point is almost every projection, mock draft ranking I've seen has him going past Detroit at 15.
Which is crazy, and that's why I need to continue to do a deeper dive on everyone before him, because when I watch him, I see someone who's dominating a league, has that high offensive upside, and, he has to work on those commitment issues in the defensive side of the puck. But if those are the things we're nitpicking on, I don't know. You got to take a real serious look at what your board is and if he's the guy for you at 15.
Yeah, and you have to remember, we've hammered this point, but you're drafting at 15, not 5. So you're going to have, if you want to draft a player with high-end abilities, you're going to have these things that make it a bit of a speculative pick. But this is exactly the kind of speculative pick that I like for Detroit. And again, you're exactly right, Evan. It depends on what your team interprets him to be and how much they think his improvement can still come. I think this is a guy who can fill out into a pro frame sooner rather than later. And I had similar concerns of, is he too much of a perimeter guy and can he break through the middle and get to high danger areas, especially as a centerman, you're going to want that. But he has the physical ability to do so, or should. And with the talent that you both described, he's the kind of player that it's a risk for sure. But most other picks of this kind of archetype are at pick 15. So it's a risk I would be willing to consider. And I think, one, he'd be high on my board of potential Red Wings picks. And two, I fully agree with you, Evan. He's the kind of guy who I can see going way earlier than 15.
I think teams really love that adversity story. They'll definitely ask him that kind of stuff in the interview. I would imagine this is a kid who interviews extremely well with teams. And like I said, I wouldn't be shocked if he goes way above his projections, because I think this kid's got 97% of the kind of stuff you need to make it in the NHL right now.
And two things relative to Detroit specifically. You could argue this type of player is the exact type of player that is desperately lacking in the entire Red Wings organization, especially in the prospect pipeline. And two, he's going to be playing in their backyard next year. So if they want a hand in his development, he's right there.
That's important. Like, not everyone can go over to Sweden with Kronwall and Lidstrom and all them. Like, you're going to want these guys to develop close to home, and Detroit needs this kind of player in their system. Yeah, he's one of them to me. I really like the potential for him to be there. Okay, let's jump into some NHL news now that we've wrapped up our prospect profile. The conference finals are set. Brad, you have gone 12 for 12 in your predictions so far. This is a sad, sad day for Evan and I. I got 3 of the 4 conference finalists right. I think you are...
I haven't looked at mine.
Yeah, goodness knows you're not going to be able to remember. You'll find it in about 5 minutes.
I had Dallas and Florida in the finals, so I know I'm at least 50% correct.
Same.
But Edmonton takes out Vancouver in Game 7. Skinner outlasted Shilovs. Neither of them were particularly convincing that they would be able to do it again, but still, Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, and the Edmonton Oilers live on, and the Vancouver Canucks' glory run of a year is over. What do you make of that series?
That was a fun series.
It was.
2 fan bases that hate each other. The good old Canadian matchup that we don't get often enough. And
shame about Brock Besser with the blood clot issue. That sucks a lot.
That guy has been just dealt tough hand after tough hand. But it was a series we wanted. High scoring, no goaltending, crazy fan bases. From an entertainment standpoint, phenomenal.
You know what surprised me about it? Not that Leon Draisaitl was the standout player for Edmonton. I think he's really underappreciated. It reminds me a lot of when Henrik Zetterberg was turning it on for the Red Wings and he just randomly became the best player on the planet in the postseason. Leon Draisaitl's obviously doing that at a way higher offensive clip, not comparing the output. But he has outshone McDavid, and McDavid was quieted more than I thought he would be in that series. Like, Vancouver stifled him a bit more than I anticipated.
Well, he's got a bigger challenge in this next series because I think they're pretty convincingly the underdogs going up against Dallas.
Didn't McDavid still have 9 points in 7 games?
Yeah. What a bum.
What a loser.
Yeah.
What an absolute casual.
That's only like 9 times the points that Elias Pettersson had.
You know what? When they signed that contract, I was like, he could have commanded more. But if he was coming into free agency after that performance and didn't do much better, like,
he's a West Coast Mitch Marner.
There are people unironically saying that. I don't see him.
I believe the phrase was more Saskatchewan, less Stockholm.
Oh my!
Oh, someone said that?
Evan,
someone-
I wish to be as offline as you.
Yeah.
It'd be a great day if I was.
That's actually a hilarious saying, but like so bad.
I've made it a point in my life over the last couple of years to not get in Twitter fights and not engage trolls and not engage morons. And my life has been better off for it. It's one of the greatest decisions I've made in my life. But even on that one, I had to quote tweet it with just a picture of Nick Lidstrom holding the cup just because of how insanely stupid it was.
So am I allowed to say it if the Red Wings make the playoffs and some predominant European player plays poorly?
Evan, yes, because that would be funny as hell.
Okay.
And this is as much airtime as I'm going to give to it. If you are a soft Swede, and I'm doing that thing that Evan hates where I just repeat my own tweets on air.
Well, I haven't seen them, so this is news to me.
You didn't have your text-to-speech on today?
No.
If you are there's nothing wrong with wanting hard-nosed players on your team or talented players who are more hard-nosed. If you have a player who is a soft Swede, his issue is that he's soft, not that he's Swedish. I can't believe we have to say this out loud. You idiots.
No, but all Swedes are soft. Like, have you watched Victor Hedman play? So soft. Like, there's no physicality to that game whatsoever. And he'll never win a cup. No chance.
Like,
and
trying to say every player of a certain nationality is that player type is like, I'm sorry, that's for Facebook comments. Like, that's the kind of hockey discussion that just melts my brain and makes me want to not do any hockey content ever.
That's the kind of stuff you'd hear if you were at a Kitchener Rangers game walking in the concourse and overheard one of the old heads standing along the wall.
You're having some drinks in your buddy's parents' garage, and you're drinking his dad's beer, so you have to sit and listen to whatever he says, and that's what he says, and you nod and agree because you're drinking his Busch Light.
That is way more apt.
Like, that's it. That's the only appropriate time. Anyways.
That is hilarious.
It's so stupid, man. Patterson had a rough series. Vancouver, it's been talked about a lot. I think they're going to go through some changes this offseason, but now that the conference finals are set, there's a really good argument to be made that these are the most predictable and best four teams remaining. And I think you have a hard time saying that any specific team is the outright favorite to win at this point.
Oh, any one of these four could win, and nobody's going to be surprised. And the Cinderella stories are always fun, but this is going to be better hockey. This is going to be better entertainment. Like, there's no bad series here. There's no bad potential Stanley Cup final here. It's going to be great hockey, and there's going to be more than enough storylines to keep everybody interested. Oddly enough, Dallas and Edmonton apparently have, like, Dallas is Edmonton's number one playoff opponent in terms of how many times they've played, which is weird to me.
Really?
Yeah. It's weird.
That doesn't say that. Oh, anyways.
But yeah, apparently, well, they both came into the league around the same time. I think it was like early 80s, right? Well, the Stars, Minnesota North Stars got there a little earlier, but
yeah,
weird to think about. I do remember all the crazy playoff series between the two, late 90s, early 2000s. So if we get any of that, this will be great.
For a sport that's extremely unpredictable, it's pretty shocking that the teams that are all there, mostly the teams everyone would have predicted.
Well, that's how I got here on my bracket. I just took the favorite in every series because they were the favorite. And I do it every year because eventually I knew one day it would be right, and here we are.
Here's the thing about these four teams. The Rangers, obviously, everyone was saying, what are they going to do at 5-on-5? And that's why I picked Carolina over them, which was stupid because they have Shesterkin and they're still an insanely talented team. And with Florida, that's the team where everyone's saying that's a team who's designed for the playoffs. Dallas was the Cup favorite coming into the season. So you now have the Connor McDavid, Leon Draisaitl, Edmonton Oilers, and their speculative at best goaltending situation as probably fourth of four in terms of who's the most favored to win the Cup. Who does the NHL want in the Cup finals? You know they want Connor McDavid in the finals.
Connor McDavid versus the biggest market in the United States. That's what they want.
Yeah.
The Rangers and the Oilers would be just the salary cap riser that everybody needs.
I think I saw something that either the previous round or the NHL playoffs up to this point have been the most watched in maybe ever. I'll have to pull that statistic back up. So the NHL playoffs have been a raving success from a viewership perspective. if they can get the teams that they would prefer into the finals, it would only be the cherry on top.
Can't wait for a goalie interference call to go the Rangers' way at some point to turn the series and just watch the conspiracy theories fly.
I'll tell you, like, you have developed actual hatred from fan bases, and that's hatred is passion, and passion is eyes and clicks and viewers, and that's what's good for the league. Also, like, it's fun. It's fun. As someone who had no skin in the game, watching like all the outrage online when that Vancouver kid, spouted off about the Oilers and said some pretty inappropriate stuff. And everyone's like, oh, that's a kid. Like, why is he saying that? There's no respect, blah, blah, blah. And then these two fan bases are going at it. And it's like, who hates who more and who's hated more by the league? That's all stuff that it just drives engagement. It fuels future rivalries. It's why I like when teams who don't typically play each other play in the playoffs, because it just creates passion out of nowhere. And yeah, like, I don't really care about them. Like, we talk about the salary cap because we want to know how your team's going to be constructed. I don't actually care about millionaires getting richer or billionaires getting richer, but it is good for the league when, the playoffs do better, and then there's more gate-driven revenue and there's more TV revenue, and then the salary cap will go up over time.
Well, we're also this close to a Dallas-New York final, in which case Gary Bettman's getting a call from Roger Goodell going, how did you do that?
Well, our Dallas actually is in Toronto.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Okay, predictions very quickly for the two conference finals.
I'm going to go Florida in 7, Dallas in 6.
I have Dallas, Florida in the finals, and I think my head matches my heart.
I had transparently Carolina over Florida in the Eastern Conference Finals. Logic would dictate that I shouldn't pick the Rangers to go through over Florida. I think Florida is so well constructed for the playoffs, but just because I want to pick against my own stupidity from before, I'll pick the Rangers to go through in 7 games. And I'll get crazy. I think Skinner just won't do it. I say Dallas in 5. They're a very complete team. I'm betting against Draisaitl, McDavid like a dummy, but hey.
This is by far the most difficult task the Oilers have had, right?
Yeah.
They're looking at a Dallas team that's primed and believes they can win a cup. Like, they have not played a team like this yet.
Dallas got some rest, which was key here. They ran through Vegas and Colorado, probably the two best teams in the league, no longer in the playoffs. Edmonton went through Vancouver and LA. One of them is very battle-tested right now, and one of them struggled with an okay team.
How Dallas comes out game 1 will be very indicative of how this series will go.
Okay, maybe these will be bigger discussions in the future, but Tampa Bay reacquired Ryan McDonaugh from the Nashville Predators. That was a trade that was kind of like undone over time. They traded back for him. It's been well known that McDonough wasn't happy to have been traded away from Tampa Bay in the first place, was trying to get back forever, and Barry Trotz confirmed it. He essentially, said, if you can ever explore the option to send me back to Tampa Bay, it's something that's important to me, and Barry Trotz had a lot of respect for him and said, yep, absolutely. So they got McDonough in a 4th back, Tampa Bay did, in exchange for a 2024 7th and a 2025 2nd. So not a cheap price to pay. And this kicked up a lot of discussion on what Tampa Bay is doing and, why are they giving up picks when their prospect cupboard is so bare, and very obviously they're not the Tampa Bay of old where they're just running through the playoffs each year. And I understand fundamentally, like, as Red Wings fans, we know Ken Holland, especially post 2013, like, they hung on too long, way too long. They mortgaged futures to try to keep it going for way too long. This is Tampa Bay, though. You have Andrei Vasilevsky, who's still probably odds on the best goalie on the planet, if not at worst top 3. You have a heart-level superstar forward in Nikita Kucherov. You have Braden Point. You have a number 1 defenseman in Victor Hedman. You have Sergachev, Cirelli, Hagel. You didn't
even name Steven Stamkos, who's a 40-goal scorer.
Well, let's see if they can keep him. But yeah. There's a lot of really good players, and the depth isn't as effective as it was in the past, but you have to try to keep it going if you're Tampa Bay. Like, you don't pack it in now.
They are a lot closer to being a Stanley Cup team than they are of being a team that could pull off a rebuild. A lot of those players you rattled off are on long-term contracts. So the fundamental makeup of this team is not changing anytime soon. Kucherov's heart level. Vasilevsky is capable of being one of the best goalies in the world. Yeah, they might lose Stamkos. But again, Is it crazy to think that in the next 2 years, Vasilevsky refines his form and they go on a run?
I would expect it. I don't even think it's crazy. I would put money on it happening.
Yeah, so of course you're going to keep going. We've had this conversation about Pittsburgh for 10 years. And they rattled off a couple cups in that time, and they've made a couple more playoff runs. And only now is it really, really starting to look like they're cooked.
And Pittsburgh never once had a goalie who sniffed the level of Andrei Vasilevsky. If you're telling me Marc-Andre Fleury, we're fighting, because he has never been close to Vasilevsky. Jordan Binnington got hot at the right time, and St. Louis won a cup. Vasilevsky can win Tampa Bay a cup if you take away one or two of the core players that I just named. I don't feel crazy saying that, because that's how much goaltending can make a difference in the playoffs, especially as goaltending gets worse on average across the NHL. You're right, Brad. This team is a lot closer to winning a cup than not. And let's say they did pack it in and they got ultimate value out of these guys and they kept very few of them. What are the odds that these high-end picks and pieces that you're going to bring in are going to turn into anything close to what these guys are?
Almost zero.
Almost zero. It's so hard to do.
You have essentially 4 likely Hall of Fame players on your team. If you ever get 4 Hall of Fame players in 50 years, like, some teams never see that.
Like, how much legacy has been built in Tampa Bay from this franchise? You might be able to call it a dynasty even.
Oh, they're set for a good long while. Like, that's a team that does well in their market now. And it is because of sustained success.
Anyways, I was like, yeah, I understand they're looking down the barrel of a tough rebuild in the future, but when you have what they have, you ride that for as long as you have it. And I would not be surprised to see Tampa Bay's name as one of the final 4 teams, for example, in the NHL again. Okay, you know what? Let's save Mitch Marner and those rumors, because those are going to go on all offseason. And I like the idea of torturing Brad with yet another Marner trade.
More Saskatchewan, less Scarborough.
Oh, that is actually such a...
Print it. New t-shirt.
That is good. That is good. How many Labatt Blue Lights have you had?
0.
We've got to fix that. Sheldon Keefe to the New Jersey Devils was reported right before we recorded, so we thought maybe he would take some time off before coming back, but you don't blame NHL coaches for wanting to stay in the game.
Everyone seemed very happy about that from a Devils perspective. Do I just have the wrong impression of Sheldon Keefe? Is he actually a good coach?
So hard to judge out of Toronto, right? Like, sometimes good coaches just wear out with teams. That's the nature of the NHL.
It's always a what have you done for me lately league in terms of...
Well, my God, he had to coach the Toronto Maple Leafs.
Which sucks. But also, it's probably important to point out that in that 7-game series against the Bruins, that was one of the best defensive performances that team's ever put out. And when you look at their goaltending and their defense, that's probably a testament to the coach. And the reason they lost was their big guns couldn't score. So do with that information what you will. But I'm not saying Sheldon Keefe's ever going to win a Jack Adams. And he's had some insanely stupid quotes to the media, but I don't think it's the worst hiring ever.
I think it's because it's the pressure cooker that is the Toronto Maple Leafs. And he's also had some players who are not exactly easy to deal with publicly, Mitch Marner being the face of that right now. Yeah, I also think their organizational structure is stupid. Like, the top-down pressure from Brendan Shanahan, if you want to have a president of hockey ops, fine. But if it is so visible where everyone at all times knows what Brendan Shanahan is doing or asking his GMs or his coaches to do, to me, that's just been the Brendan Shanahan show, which has not been for the benefit of that team. Okay, let's jump into overtime on this episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. Overtime is proudly brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Patreon.com/Winged Wheel Podcast if you want to support the show and join the Dub Dub Club, the Discord, the giveaways, the bonus episodes, all that, and lots more. Some of your benefits. You allow us to continue to produce this show and make it bigger and better, especially through the off season. You allow us to produce other great content like Expected by Whom, a show hosted by Prashanth Iyer and Sean Shapiro. They recently interviewed Jake Wallman, a fantastic interview that you should go check out. Give them a follow. You also allow us to support the Jamie Daniels Foundation through events like Winged Wheel Podcast Night in partnership with the Detroit Red Wings and the Grand Rapids Griffins. And a lot more. So again, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. Let's start with a question from Brandon Nimps. Says, go to food and beverage at the LCA during a Wings game.
4 square pizza has to be.
Much like Guinness is better in Ireland, Little Caesars pizza is the best from Little Caesars Arena. That is not a joke.
Give me that deep dish.
I don't know if it's still there, but when they opened the LCA, they had a zesty poutine. And I've talked about it on this podcast before. It was a good poutine. Big fan. Oh, you know what they started doing is the deep fried cheese curd poutines. And those are very good.
That feels like not a
How many
traditional
calories
poutine,
is
Ryan.
that? Do you even ask?
Calories don't count in arenas, man. Everyone
That's
knows
true.
that. If the Red Wings win, the calories don't count. It's a new promotion they have going on. I will say I'm in pain the next day, but I will eat it every single time. Wildcat Dallas Drake says, what do you think the chances are that more than one of Kasper, Mazur, or Danielson make it on the team to start the season? It seems highly unlikely all three will make it, but they have to bring up one at least, right?
More than one, I'll say 51%.
Yeah, I would call it likelier than not that it's not a guarantee, but yeah, more than one seems to make sense. All Motor No Hand says, without knowing which free agents we keep or sign and expecting a step back with a youth infusion, what would you guys consider an acceptable point total next season?
What did they finish at this year? 91?
Mm-hmm.
89.
Yeah, I would say plus minus, obviously plus would be great, but plus minus 2 to 3 points would be a happy result in my mind. Next question here from Wizard of Osgood says, the Wings' decision and goal is probably the difference between making the playoffs and being on the outside once again. Who are some of your realistic targets to go after to pair with Lyon?
If you look at value, production, contract, all that stuff, I think I've landed on John Gibson.
And that's a big price.
Yeah, but it's going to be less than Markstrom, less than Saros, and he's probably the next best option available in terms of talent.
Okay, moving on here to the next question. We have Give Wallman the Heart. It says, what makes moving a guy like Justin Hall so difficult? Are there not a number of bottom feeders with $1 billion in cap space who could benefit from an NHL caliber defenseman if you throw in a 3rd round pick with him? It's not like when you're making
Don't try to be polite about this, right? It's because he sucks and he's paid a lot of money. That's the reality of it.
Well, no, it's not even a lot of money. He comes with 2 more years at $3.4 million. So it's if he was scratched all year, he couldn't even crack the Red Wings lineup, and they weren't a playoff team in the end. You're getting $3.4 million for this year and next. That's pricey. Like, that is not going to be cheap to do. It's the second year that really makes it a little bit more expensive.
Yeah, and obviously saying he sucks is an over-exaggeration. He's an okay depth defenseman at the NHL, but okay depth defensemen make league minimum for on 1-year deals. He's getting $3 million for 2 more years, and every team out there that is looking like a San Jose and a Chicago who's just looking for bodies to fill the role, they can go get those guys for 1 year, $800,000. And Detroit's not trading him because they don't want to give up a 1st or 2nd round pick to unload him to these teams, because those teams could absolutely use him and could absolutely afford him, but they're going to be of the mindset, we're doing you a favor, pay up.
Chimkim Nuggets says this team seems to have a lot of needs to get over the hump next season and beyond. Example, another offensive difference maker, right shot D, improved goaltending, and better defense from the forward group. It seems unlikely we have the cap or NHL ready prospect pool to address them all this offseason. If you had to choose one thing to fix by acquisition this year, which would give us the most mileage? Love the content, fellas, even when Evan is too drunk to remember it. That's when it's at the best.
Who says I don't remember it?
Evan, you don't remember anything.
I remember being here.
What day of the week is it?
Wednesday. I golfed.
Right, forgot. The one acquisition they can make that would get the most mileage out of would be the high-end forward, in my mind.
Which probably isn't available.
The second most, and maybe you can contend would be the most, because if they had one this year, they would have made the playoffs, is a starting goalie.
Agreed.
A guy who can play 50 games, 55 games at a reasonable level of consistency. Okay, last one here. Brandon Dortmund says, after the season, what do you believe is Nate Danielson's potential ceiling in the NHL? Do you believe it's higher than where we thought it was when he was drafted, or just more clear?
Maybe a little higher. I think the ceiling is still 2C, but maybe just a touch more impactful at 2C.
But yeah, I would tend to agree. And I think the way you phrased it, Brandon, is it just more clear. Like, we talked about Nate Danielson when he was drafted, and we acknowledged what some of the concerns may have been depending on your perspective on him. And it was that you would have thought he'd have more output based on the suspected talents that he had, but it just wasn't there. So when he got to a better team, did that output increase? You just didn't know until he went to a better team on Portland, and it did. So it did just illuminate it a little bit more. Okay, we are going to wrap up this episode of the Winged Wheel podcast. Thank you all so very much for tuning in. We'll be back with you on Sunday. Really, really appreciate all of you. If you're a new listener, welcome to the show. And if you're a listener of old, we hope you are enjoying our usual off-season content. Thank you to Labatt Blue Light for sponsoring this episode, and to all of our patrons who make this show possible. If you want to support us, patreon.com/wingedwheelpodcast. And if Patreon's not for you, you can give us a like or a rating wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about the show. It does help. And to all of our name level supporters on Patreon, we can't thank you enough. Arjun Shankar, Yves Bartels on behalf of the Sarah Grand Foundation, Aikfer, Samuel Soderholm, Icon, Victor Zetterberg, Ryan, Brad, I'm swallowing Hannah, Glenn Brabham, Croner's Left Knee, Ashley Van Conant, Sea-Line, Keenan O'Donohue, Yanni Burgers, Meals on Wheels, Matthew M. Rice, Admiral Matt S. at the Cheesebag Navy, Avery Sloppy Seconds, Beep, Carl Britannia Nanaluski, Carl Provy, Citizen High Five, Clip Clop Nene, Connor Scovey, Craig Kibble, Denny's Gamer Girl, Derek Enstam, Cider, Dickens, formerly Marlon Winchester, DJ Denton, God Creatives, Give Blood Fight Probert, Goose Looney's Drinking Club, Hockeytown Love, Hockeytown Matt, Hassam Al-Qassem, Jay Gollum, Jacob Turner, Jeff Pridemore, Joel Miranda, Jonathan Miller, Kalen Wood, Marcus, Matt Keeler, Matt McKay, Michael Edlund, R.A., Raul Pudd. That one, I keep thinking my brain's mixing that one up, but it's actually the way he wrote it out. S. Klein, brand new name level supporter. Welcome to the Dub Club. Scott Martin, Skeletor, Scree and Lube, Stoli 70 Wingnut. That's what I appreciate about you. Utah, Stormin Mormons, Wallman's Elite Dancing D, Iserplan Stan, General Andy Bohan of the Cheesebag Army, Sam Bankson, AB, Adam Rose, All Motor, No Hands, Axel Sandin Pellikka, Bellingham Acid Balls, Brad Simmons, Chi-Town Wings Fan, Chimkum Nuggets, Chuck Buffchest, the Charpless Goon, Commander Ben Barron of the Cheesebag Space Force, Connor Leighton, Corey Prida, Darren Fick, Datsuk's Dirty Deke, Eric Nance, Evans Fourth Putt, Frank Stanley, Gene Sullivan, Griffey Boy, James Pridemore, Jeremiah Dobo, JM Rhapsody, Joey Jojo Shabadoo, John Evans Derogatory, John Ingles, Josh Yelton, Kevin McCracken, Known Petrie Truther, the Mexinadian, Quaz, Les Grossman's Ungodly Firestorm, Linda Hull, Michigan Boy in Avs Country, Ophelia, Red Wing Tar Heel, Reed, Salt Lake Sugar Girlie, Sean Mason, new name level supporter, welcome Sean, Steven, the Hodag, the Hat 123, Wings fan in St. Louis, Scott. This episode is sponsored by Twisters, Tom Iserplan Respecter, Throw the Road Puss, and your second favorite patron. Thank you all so very much. We'll talk to you Sunday.
Thanks for tuning in to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Be sure to check out wingedwheelpodcast.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll also find links to other ways to support the show, such as Patreon, official podcast apparel, and more. And don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at Winged Wheel Pod. And of course, the hosts at Brad Crisco, at Ryan Hanna WWP, and at Hockeytown Evan.